My name is Vivienne Mercer, and I was 3,000 meters above the snow-capped Alps when the man I hated more than anyone in the world saved my life. His name was Gideon Blackwood. He was a titan of international industry, a man shrouded in absolute silence, colossal wealth, impeccable dark suits, and that chilling, icy confidence that made armed men lower their eyes before he even uttered a word. I worked for him at Blackwood Industries, the legal, dazzlingly clean facade of a vast shadow empire whose true nature everyone politely kept silent about. On paper, I was his chief structural security analyst. In reality, I was the woman who inspected his secret facilities, double-checked hidden blueprints, carried confidential files for him, and watched from the corner of polished boardrooms as the most powerful men in Europe paled under his gaze. I knew his underground bunkers, his restricted transport hubs, his sealed contracts, and his quiet, barely perceptible threats. But I also knew something else, with absolute, unshakable certainty. Gideon Blackwood had no heart. I learned this lesson exactly 2 years ago, when my younger brother Leo lay in intensive care after a devastating mine collapse, awaiting emergency evacuation, and I stood in his office, my pride shattered. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of him. I simply begged him to deploy the private rescue team, Blackwood, which was the only one with the equipment capable of cutting through the rubble that very hour. I quietly said, "Please, Mr. Blackwood, my brother won't live until morning. Let the helicopters take off." He looked at me in the presence of 3 foreign investors and replied coldly, "Personal disasters shouldn't stop production. We don't risk millions in assets for unauthorized civilian operations." That phrase didn't just wound me. It burned and froze something deep inside my chest. My brother survived only because an unknown, completely anonymous mercenary search party reached the mine a couple of hours before dawn. But I never connected that miracle with Blackwood. Why should I? Gideon had already shown me who he truly was. From that day on, I stopped expecting even a shred of human gentleness from him. I repaid him with impeccable work, icy professionalism, and a hatred so controlled that from the outside it seemed absolute devotion. And so 2 years later, I sat across from him in the cockpit of his private heavy-lift helicopter, having personally ordered me to accompany him on an inspection of a remote alpine data center. Beyond the glass, there was nothing but blinding whiteness and craggy peaks. Inside, the cabin was dominated by matte black leather, carbon fiber panels, 2 silent bodyguards, a pilot behind a soundproof door, and Gideon Blackwood, scrolling through a tablet as if the sky itself belonged to his conglomerate. He wore a black shirt with the collar open, a heavy dark coat folded beside him, and an expensive watch on his wrist. His dark hair was slicked back, and the sharp lines of his jaw made his face seem like a sculpture. He was handsome in that fierce, predatory way that a woman notices against her better judgment, even when every cell in her body screams danger. I kept my eyes glued to the graphs on my laptop screen. "You look at me as if you want to bury me alive under this snow," he said, without looking up from the documents. I slightly closed the lid of the laptop. "I was just wondering if people like you ever feel guilty." The guard at the door stirred as if I'd taken a step toward a loaded gun. Gideon slowly flipped a page on his tablet. "Guilt is an ineffective waste of internal resources." "Of course, that's exactly what you would say." His eyes lifted and met mine, gray cold, so still that my pulse instantly stopped. "Vivienne, don't start a game you're not ready to see through to the end." Hearing my name spoken by him was always unbearable. It sounded too controlling, too intimate, as if he knew things about me I didn't allow myself to know. I leaned forward, anger giving me more courage than wisdom. "I brought it to the finale on the day when my brother almost died underground while you were discussing production efficiency." A ringing silence fell over the cockpit. Gideon's face didn't change, he didn't flinch, he didn't offer any excuses. But something flickered in the depths of his eyes, a dark shadow gliding across the icy water. Before I could process it, the helicopter was thrown sideways with such force that the laptop flew off my lap and crashed to the floor. The crystal glass on the console shattered. One of the guards grabbed the handrail. The world outside tilted at a wild angle. The pilot's voice came over the speakers, clipped and panicked. "Sir, tail rotor failure! Loss of control!" Gideon instantly rose from his seat, and at that moment the starboard engine exploded. Orange flames licked the glass of my window. The helicopter began to plummet. It didn't look like turbulence or a hard landing. The sky simply vanished, the ground rushing towards me at breakneck speed. My stomach churned. The emergency lights flared blood red. Thin streams of black smoke billowed from the vents. One of the guards shouted something in German, the other clutched his seat. The cockpit door swung open and the pilot yelled, "Form up! Strike in 40 seconds! 40 seconds!" The words squeezed the air out of me. My hands instantly went numb. My seatbelt was loose because I was too angry, too proud, and too distracted by our argument to tighten it properly. I tried to latch the buckle, but my fingers trembled and slipped. The helicopter's body spun. My shoulder slammed hard into the seat's bulkhead. Across the aisle, amid the chaos, Gideon spotted me. He rushed forward, unbuckling his own belt. "Sir, stay where you are," the guard shouted. Blackwood ignored him. He struggled through the falling, spinning cabin, his hands braced on the backs of his seats, moving through the frenzy as if panic had no power over him. A heavy metal case tore free of its mountings and struck him hard in the ribs. A shard of broken glass sliced across his palm. He didn't even flinch. He reached my seat, dropped to one knee in front of me, and snatched the strap from my weakened fingers. "Don't touch me!" I screamed in horror. His eyes were tightly fixed on mine. "Now is not the time to hate me, Vivienne. It's the only thing I have left." Pain contorted his face so quickly I barely had time to notice. Then he pulled the strap around my waist tight and locked it. There was a click. The sound was quiet, final, and terrifying. The helicopter lurched downwards again. The metal behind us screeched horribly. The wing outside the window blazed ever brighter. Gideon gripped the armrests of my chair tightly, completely shielding me with his body. "What are you doing?" My voice broke into a thin, helpless whisper. "I'm trying to keep you alive. You will die." A shadow of a smile touched his lips, but there was not a drop of joy in it. "Then at least you can hate me in complete safety." I looked at him, completely unable to understand this version of his. The Gideon Blackwood I knew despised pain, considered the needs of others a weakness, and turned compassion into a waste of money. This Gideon had a trickle of dark blood running down his temple, one hand pinning me to the chair, and beyond the glass, the sharp alpine cliffs were rapidly approaching. His palm, warm, stained with blood, lay on my cheek, forcing me to look at him and not at the approaching death. "When we hit, keep your mouth open, protect your head, and don't even think about fighting the belt." My throat tightened. Just before the impact, he hadn't lied to me, and that frightened me more than the raging fire. In that final second, as the cabin cracked at the seams and death rose up to meet me in a blinding white shroud, I wanted him to know. "I hate you," I whispered. His thumb brushed gently across my skin once, breaking down the last barriers within me. "Good," he replied. "Hate gives strength, use it." The snowy slope swallowed the helicopter. The impact shattered the world. Metal screamed, glass exploded into a million shards. An icy whirlwind of snow and soot tore into the cockpit with devastating force. Gideon's body fell on top of me, his arm gripping my head tightly, my face pressed to his chest, to the smell of burning gunpowder, blood, and that same expensive perfume I always subconsciously noticed in the office. For one impossible second, I heard the frantic, steady beat of his heart. Then the fuselage tore apart. The lights went out, and everything plunged into darkness. I came to with the taste of wet snow and blood on my tongue. At first I thought I was dead, but the dead don't feel their ribs screaming with pain every time they try to breathe. I opened my eyes. Blinding, merciless daylight stretched around me. The blizzard had died down, replaced by a freezing silence. The wreckage of the Black Titan lay scattered across the white slope, like the bones of some prehistoric monster. Gideon Blackwood's heavy helicopter was torn neatly in half. The tail section was stuck in a deep ravine, and thick black smoke lazily rose from the mangled cockpit. There were no roads, no rescuers, no communication, only endless snow-covered peaks in all directions and a blank wall of frozen forest just below the slope. I raised myself up on trembling hands, almost losing consciousness from a sharp flash of pain in my side. "Help!" I screamed. My voice sounded hoarse and weak. "Is anyone alive?" Not a sound came from the wreckage. Not a single guard responded. The pilot didn't curse. The silence after a plane crash is never peaceful. It's cruel. It makes every absence of voice feel like a tangible body. Then a low, ragged groan sounded behind me. I spun around to see Gideon lying next to the ruined engine bay, pinned beneath a heavy titanium panel. Blood was caked on his face, the collar of his black shirt torn. One of his legs was trapped beneath the metal, and his free hand was digging deep into the icy snow as he struggled to free himself. His eyes met mine. "Vivienne," he croaked. Relief washed over me with such force that I became afraid. "Gideon?" His gaze shifted somewhere behind me, towards the broken tank. "Run." I turned my head and froze. A thin orange streamer of fire slowly but surely crawled across the snow, feeding on the leaking jet fuel. It was heading straight for the broken wing. Where he lay, my body froze. The man I hated was trapped face to face with the explosion, and for one terrible second I had received exactly what I thought I so desperately wanted. A world without Gideon Blackwood. I could take a step back, tell myself he got what he deserved, let the fire do its work and return home, carrying my hatred as proof that justice is sometimes the color of flame. His voice came again, quieter and weaker. "Vivienne, go away." I looked at the blood on his forehead, at his hand which had just tightened my belt, at his body which had taken the full force of the blow. I hated him for making me choose. I grabbed a piece of carbon fiber spar sticking out of the snow and ran toward it, cutting off the flames. The heat seared my face before I even reached it. Smoke filled my lungs. Gideon's eyes widened with rage. "I ordered you to run. And I asked you not to touch me in the helicopter. We're both bad at following orders." I drove the fragment under the edge of the titanium panel and leaned my whole body on it. The metal barely moved. The pain in my ribs flared with renewed intensity, but I pushed again and again, screaming through clenched teeth. Gideon, pale as a bruise, helped me with his free hand pushing the plate from below. The fire came close. A small pocket of fuel under the wing burst into flame, forcing me to close my eyes. Vivienne, stop it! The tank is going to explode! Shut up and drag your leg, he looked at me. Something very close to absolute astonishment flashed in his eyes through the soot and blood. I pressed the lever with all the fury that had been building inside me for 2 years. The panel rose a couple of inches. Gideon, with a low, terrible growl, jerked his trapped leg free. I grabbed his jacket, he grabbed my wrist, and we tumbled backwards down the slope. We'd barely crawled a dozen meters when the helicopter's wing exploded. The blast threw us face first into the snow. Gideon spun midair, taking the brunt of the impact on his good shoulder and covering me again as burning debris and clods of earth rained down. For a few seconds I heard nothing but the unbearable ringing in my ears. His weight pressed down on me. His hot breath burned my neck. His heart pounded wildly against my ribcage. He was alive, I was alive, and I hated myself for having felt such wild, insane gratitude at first. "Are you okay?" he asked hoarsely, too close, his voice trembling with hidden, almost aggressive anxiety. I pushed him weakly in the chest. "Get off me." He immediately rolled onto his side, instantly pressing his palm to his ribs and exhaling heavily through his teeth. His left forearm was horribly mangled, the skin peeled away where it had been pinned by the metal. Blood dripped from the cuts on his arm. The explosion had scattered soot through his hair, destroyed his expensive shirt, stripped him of every inch of his flawless, polished authority, and yet his eyes feverishly scanned my face before he deigned to inspect his own wounds. "You're bleeding from your temple," he noted, "and half your suit is torn. Answer the question." "I'm alive." He turned his gaze to the burning wreckage of the helicopter. "That's the only answer that matters right now." I followed his gaze. The fire was eating away at what remained of Blackwood Industries' opulence. Somewhere out there, in that choking smoke, were the people who had obeyed his orders just an hour ago. I knew they were dead even before Gideon said it out loud. His jaw clenched. He tried to stand too quickly and lurched sideways. I caught his elbow before he could think. He looked down at my hand. I jerked it away as if I'd been burned. "No need for sentimentality," I said crisply. "I only saved you because you saved me. A fair deal." "Exactly." He paused, looking at me point blank, and then turned away. "Then we're even." This word should have brought me satisfaction, but it didn't. We scooped up everything we could carry before the fire destroyed the last of our supplies. Gideon gave orders because it was his primal instinct, and I argued with his every word because it was mine. In the end, our survival arsenal looked pitiful. 4 bottles of water, an army first aid kit, 2 thermal blankets, a shard of mirror from the toilet stall, the pilot's folding knife, 3 MRE packs, a coil of climbing cord, and a metal container. No radio, no signal, no distress beacon. The electronics were completely burned out. Gideon stood in the snow, counting supplies with the same cold, icy focus he used when planning the takeover of a multinational company. I genuinely hated how useful he was, even here. "First we need shelter from the wind," he said. "Then a fire, treatment of wounds, and a signal marker that can be seen from the air." Still in command. Still alive thanks to your orders? You meant thanks to you? His gray eyes bored into mine. Yes, that's right. The simple, direct answer caught me off guard. Gideon Blackwood was never one to shower praise on others. He hardly ever acknowledged others' accomplishments. I turned away so he wouldn't notice the change in my expression. "Great, what should I do?" "Sit down. It's useless. You have a traumatic brain injury and possibly broken ribs. Sit down before you faint. I don't take orders from you here on this mountain." "Then take advice from the man you just pulled out of the fire." He reached for the first aid kit. I took a step back. "I can treat the wound myself. You don't even see her. I feel it." "The feeling of blood running down your face is no substitute for medical education." I glared at him. He waited, patient with that same insufferable, arrogant manner that always drove me crazy at the office. Finally, I gave in and sat down on a piece of plastic paneling. Gideon knelt in front of me, opening the first aid kit. His hands were dirty and cut, but perfectly steady. He poured antiseptic onto gauze, then paused. "It will hurt. I've survived your management style. I can handle the hand sanitizer somehow." A soft sound escaped his chest. Not quite a laugh, but something close enough to it to make me tense internally. He pressed the gauze to my temple. Pain flared, pure white. I hissed, grabbing his wrist. His skin was hot beneath my fingers. He didn't pull his hand away. "Quiet," he said quietly. The word was low, not at all soft, but for the first time there was no harshness in it. He cleaned the wound with precise, careful movements. He sat so close that I could see the fine lines of fatigue around his eyes and the tiny scar above his eyebrow, which I'd never noticed behind his enormous obsidian desk. Without his armored office, without his bodyguards, without the perfect lighting and the colossal distance he kept around himself like a shield, he looked younger. Not defenseless, never in his life, but human. And that bothered me more than the wound itself. "Why are you looking at me like that?" he asked without stopping his work. "I'm trying to understand whether the blow damaged your personality. It's too early to draw conclusions." He applied a small bandage to my temple. "Your sarcasm survived the fall. We're lucky." "Oh yes, incredible." He said it without a hint of irony, and the word hung between us longer than it should have. I was the first to look away. He moved his attention to his hand, quickly. casually, almost indifferently. I watched as blood continued to ooze from the deep cut on his knuckles. You missed a piece of carbon fiber. Everything is fine. It's inside your palm. I said, everything is fine. I snatched the tweezers and gauze from him, and I said, you missed a fragment. His eyes narrowed. Vivienne, now is not the time to play corporate defiance. I grabbed his wrist roughly and pulled his hand toward me. He let me, which surprised us both. His palm was much rougher than I expected, covered with old rough scars that couldn't have belonged to a man who'd spent his entire life signing documents in silk shirts. I carefully pulled out the sharp black shard with tweezers. He didn't even flinch, though I felt the tendons in his wrist stretch beneath my fingers. Do you feel any pain at all? I asked, bandaging his arm. Only when it is useful. There is no point in this. Most truths are meaningless to those looking from the outside. I tightened the bandage a little more than necessary, disappointed by how careful I'd subconsciously wanted to be. When I finished, he looked at his hand, then into my eyes. Thank you. The word sounded completely alien when he spoke it. I almost responded with another sharp retort, but the mountains around me were too silent, the dead were too close, and my heart was too tired for another war. By late evening, the cold had intensified. The white sun hid behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky the color of dried blood. Gideon chose a spot at the entrance to an old, dilapidated concrete pillbox, half buried in the rock just below the slope. We hauled the surviving chairs, panels, and pieces of insulation inside, constructing a crude camp. He worked with ruthless efficiency, ignoring his injuries. I worked simply because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the pilot's scream and the sky splitting overhead. At one point, Gideon was lifting a heavy piece of fuselage to block the opening, and his face suddenly turned gray. I jumped up and caught the edge before the slab collapsed. You're not okay, I snapped. I'm functional. It's not the same thing. Today, the same thing. You always talk as if you were negotiating with your own body. My body usually loses these negotiations. That's not strength. That's arrogance with bruises. He looked at me with a long, unreadable gaze. For the first time, Gideon Blackwood didn't have an immediate answer. We completed the shelter just as dusk had completely swallowed the ravine. It was ugly and cold, but it protected us from the icy wind. On the open snow in front of the pillbox, we laid out a huge cross using the black titanium panels of the helicopter. Gideon said rescue drones would notice it if they started searching the square. I didn't ask if anyone would start looking for them. Hope seemed too fragile, and I was afraid to shatter it with my own voice. As night fell, the mountains changed. The soft white snow turned into an ominous, endless darkness. The wind howled through the crevices like a living thing. Without daylight, fear instantly found its way to the surface. We shared half a pack of dry rations and took 2 sips of water each. Gideon insisted I drink more. I refused. He stared at me silently. I returned his stubborn gaze. If you try to order me to drink this, I said quietly, I'll pour the water into the snow. He handed me the bottle again, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Please. That single word completely disarmed me. I drank. Not much, but enough for him to stop watching my lips as if my survival were his personal business objective, to be achieved at any cost. How far do you think we are from civilization? I asked, looking into the darkness. Far enough to rely only on myself. That's not an answer. This is the only answer I trust. His honesty was frightening. In the office, his absolute certainty was unbearable. Here, his honest ignorance felt much worse. Do you think they'll come? My voice trembled. He didn't answer right away, and I appreciated the pause, although secretly I wished it hadn't happened. They will search, he finally said. My people will not accept my silence. Your people? Yes. Because they care about you? His face instantly turned into a stone mask. Because I am necessary. The words were pure, bitter, and almost imperceptible under his absolute control. But I heard them. Needed was not the same as loved, and I knew the difference far better than I would have liked. He rose to his feet before I could respond and began gathering up pieces of dry paneling, plastic, and insulation. We needed a fire. Do billionaires from shadow syndicates really know how to light fires? Only the most charismatic of them, he replied. I turned sharply to him. Was that a joke? Tiny. No need to make a big deal out of it. I almost smiled. Almost. He tried the pilot's broken lighter. It sparked twice, failed, flared again, and finally died. Gideon looked at it in disappointment, with the same cold disdain he usually bestowed upon incompetent top managers. Are you going to intimidate her into working? I asked. I am seriously considering this option. Let me know if she decides to apologize. This time, the corner of his mouth actually twitched upward. The movement was fleeting, tightly controlled, but I saw it, and that moment strangely shifted the air around us. He changed his method, using a knife and a piece of lithium from a ruptured helicopter battery to strike sparks onto the dry sheathing of the cables. It took much longer than I expected. His bandaged hand began to bleed again. Sweat trickled down his neck. He didn't complain, didn't curse, or ask me to take over. He worked with icy focus until a tiny ember finally caught on the dry fabric. He leaned over and blew carefully, shielding the flame with both palms. A small orange flame rose from the darkness of the pillbox. I looked at it, amazed at how much relief one tiny flame could bring. Gideon fed it slowly, with iron patience. The orange light fell on his face, softening the harsh, pitiless lines. He looked tired, not bored, not cold, not untouchable, just dead tired. "How do you know how to do this?" I asked quietly. His gaze remained fixed on the fire. "My father believed that true power must be able to survive in the absence of comfort." "Sounds like the sign above the prison gates." "That was the prison," he replied. The answer was too honest. I didn't know what to do with it. Night had cut us off completely from the rest of the world. Beyond the fire's circle of light, the cold was impenetrable. The wind rustled through the broken plastic, making my shoulders tense constantly. My clothes, soaked in the snow, began to freeze, and as a gust of air rushed into the pillbox, a violent shudder ran through me. I hugged myself tighter, trying to contain it. Gideon noticed it instantly, of course. The man noticed everything except the destruction his own words were causing. He took off his heavy fur-lined wool coat, which had been drying on the broken chair, and handed it to me. "Take it." "No. Vivienne, you're hurt. You too. And you're bigger than me." "That's not an argument. It's physics. A smaller body cools faster." "I don't want to take your coat." His gray eyes caught my gaze across the firelight. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm just asking you not to freeze to death in front of me." I hated the quiet, deep concern in his voice. I hated my own body for wanting that warmth more than my pride wanted distance. I picked up my coat with numb fingers and draped it over my shoulders. The fabric was stained with soot, smelled of smoke and gunpowder, and still held the warmth of his body. I stared into the fire to avoid looking at him. "Thank you," I squeezed out. He sat down opposite, wearing only a thin shirt with rolled-up sleeves, placing his bandaged hand on his knee. "A fair deal. I should have agreed to this. Let those words build a wall between us again. Instead..." I watched silently as his shoulders trembled ever so slightly as a gust of wind blew through the concrete. He turned away into the darkness, clenching his jaw, pretending the cold had nothing to do with him. The old Gideon would have made it look like a show of strength. In these mountains, it looked like absolute utter loneliness. We were silent for a long time. The plastic crackled in the fire. The cooling metal of the helicopter outside made quiet, monotonous clicks. I wrapped his coat tighter around myself. "Why did you save me in the helicopter?" I asked. Gideon didn't turn his head. "Because your trajectory was heading straight toward a fracture in the structure. You would have died." "That's not an answer. That's mechanics. This is the only answer that matters. No. People like you always have hidden calculations." His gaze slowly moved from the darkness to the flame. "People like me, influential, calculating cold. People who calculate every step before they take it." "And what were you thinking when you jumped over the falling plane for me?" The question hit too close to home. I looked down. "You saved me first, after all. A deal." Yes, his eyes lifted. In the light of the dying fire, they seemed not gray, but liquid silver. "Then why, when the helicopter was falling, did you scream my name?" My throat instantly went dry. I remembered that moment, not as a sound, but as the wild, animal feeling that burst from my chest when I saw him pinned under metal. Gideon, not Mr. Blackwood, not the boss. Gideon. I hated him for remembering that. "Shock," I snapped. "Of course. There is no need to say it with such irony. I would never allow myself to do that." The silence returned. But it was different. Something new had entered it. Not forgiveness, not trust. Something far more fragile and dangerous. Awareness. I shifted beneath his coat, looking at the dark line where the snow-capped peaks met the black sky. "Do you think we'll get out of here?" Gideon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, the fire casting deep shadows on his cheekbones. "Yes. You can't know that for sure." "I can't." "Then why say it with such confidence?" His eyes met mine, hard but no longer empty. "Because if I show any hesitation, you'll stop fighting. And if you stop fighting, this mountain will win. I have no intention of abandoning you to this snow, this cold rock, or your own fear." My breath caught in my throat. He seemed to realize the true weight of his words only after they had left his lips. His face instantly turned to impenetrable stone, but it was too late. I heard the crack in his armor. I looked away before he could punish himself for this flash of revelation. "I don't belong to you so you can lose me," I said quietly. "Yes," he agreed. "You don't belong." The fire burned between us, a small, stubborn fragment of life in the middle of a dead, icy wasteland. My entire body howled with exhaustion. My head was pounding. My hatred was still there, but it no longer seemed simple and understandable. The man sitting across from me had broken my heart with one icy phrase 2 years ago. An hour ago, he had shielded me from an explosion with his body. He had allowed himself to be pulled from the fire, his wounds tended, he had quietly thanked me, made an awkward joke, built a shelter, struck a flame from a piece of battery, and given me his last warmth, while he himself shivered silently in the cold darkness. None of this canceled the past. None of this explained it, and that was the main problem. Monsters are much easier when they remain monsters. Gideon Blackwood stared at the embers as if searching them for answers he'd never dared to voice. Behind him, the wrecked helicopter lay beneath the pale moonlight, vivid proof that any absolute power could crumble in seconds. I pressed my bandaged temple to the collar of his warm coat and closed my eyes. For the first time since the crash, I allowed myself to acknowledge the terrible truth. We were completely alone on a desolate alpine peak, without communication, without warmth, without food, and we had no one to trust but each other. But the most terrifying thing wasn't the ravine around us or the icy darkness. The most terrifying thing was that after that endless day, I was no longer sure I even remembered how to hate him properly. I woke up to the whistling wind and the terrifying realization that Gideon was no longer there. For the first few seconds, I couldn't remember where I was. My consciousness frantically clung to familiar landmarks. My small apartment. The noise of the avenue outside the window, the morning light on the cheap curtains, the smell of tea Leo was brewing. Then pain rudely brought me back to reality. My ribs ached unbearably. A bandage was stuck to my temple. The coat on my shoulders was too big, too soaked with soot, too unmistakably his. I stood up too abruptly, and the concrete walls of the pillbox tilted. The fire burned out, leaving behind only a pile of gray ash. The wrecked helicopter sparkled in the morning sun. The slope was completely empty. Gideon was gone. Cold panic instantly gripped my heart. It was stupid, irrational, and humiliating. Of course he was gone. Powerful people survive by always choosing themselves first. Perhaps he'd found a safer path down, a point of contact, or simply decided my injury would slow him down too much. Perhaps all his gentleness in the night was just a consequence of shock, a temporary breakdown in his system caused by blood loss and carbon monoxide. I somehow got to my feet, holding the hem of his coat with one hand and clutching a piece of carbon fiber with the other. "Gideon?" My hoarse cry echoed through the gorge. No answer. I hated the wild fear that pierced me in that moment. I hated it more than I ever hated Blackwood himself, because it sounded too much like desperate need. "Gideon!" Something crunched in the frozen forest just below the slope. I picked up the shard of plastic, my heart pounding against my ribs. Gideon emerged from the green shade of the spruce trees. He carried a thermos, which had apparently miraculously survived in the cockpit, and an armful of dry branches. A piece of cloth from the first aid kit was hastily tied around his injured arm, and a sodden black shirt clung tightly to his chest. His face remained pale, his jaw covered in dark stubble, but his eyes narrowed instantly as soon as he saw me standing. "Why are you standing here looking like you're about to declare war on this mountain?" I quickly lowered the piece of spar, hoping he hadn't noticed how my fingers were shaking. "I thought you left." The words escaped his lips before pride could block them. His expression changed. Subtle, but enough. He walked slowly through the snow toward me, as if afraid to startle me with a sudden movement. "I went to the wreckage of the cabin. I was looking for water. You could have told me. You were sleeping. I didn't wake you. And they just disappeared." He carefully placed the branches near the extinguished fire. "I never abandoned my people, Vivienne." This phrase struck right at the old wound that I had so carefully hidden from him. I looked away. "It's funny. 2 years ago, it seemed to me that you were doing this with particular pleasure." He understood perfectly well what I was talking about. I could see it in the predatory, sharp way his lips pressed together. The hospital, my brother Leo, his glass office, and that icy phrase he used like a door slamming in my face. He didn't defend himself. He simply silently opened the thermos and handed me the lid filled with clean, lukewarm water. "Drink." "I don't want. You're dehydrated. You can't know that for sure. Your lips are chapped. Your skin is pale and you can barely stand. Drink." I took the lid simply because the bet required too much energy, which I didn't have. The water washed away the taste of burnt and salt. It was far better than my pride. He watched me carefully as I swallowed, then turned away abruptly, hiding his anxiety behind his usual mask of indifference. It was just like Gideon, a step forward, then a swift retreat. A show of warmth followed immediately by an attempt to pass it off as cold strategy. We spent the entire first half of the day turning survival into monotonous drudgery. Gideon found a melting glacial stream deeper in the forest and marked out a path to it, tying pieces of white insulation to tree branches. I collected large pieces of helicopter skin to reinforce the walls of our shelter, while he used his pocket knife to chop branches for the flooring. He moved, carefully hiding his pain behind iron discipline. Every time he had to lift his injured arm too high, his jaw would tighten. I pretended not to notice until this pretense began to seem downright cruel. "Your shoulder looks terrible." I couldn't resist when he once again leaned over in pain. "It is functional." You constantly repeat these words. Functional, usable, as if your body is rented equipment that you don't have to pay for. Today, it is exactly like that. No, this is the only body you have today, and if you finish it off, we will both remain here to face the winter. He gave me a quick, piercing glance. It almost sounded like genuine concern. "There's no need to make an event out of this," I returned his phrase. A tiny, barely noticeable smile touched his lips and immediately disappeared, before it could turn into something dangerous for both of us. "You are learning my language too quickly," to my deep regret. A little later, while dragging dry branches from the edge of the forest, I stepped on a sharp fragment of a titanium screw hidden under the snow. The metal pierced the sole of my boot. A sharp pain shot through my leg. I dropped the branches and cursed under my breath, collapsing in the snow. Gideon spun around so fast the knife was in his hand before I could blink. What's happened? It's nothing serious, Gideon, just a cut. He was there instantly. Sit down, I can go. I tried to take a step and almost fell into a snowdrift. He grabbed my elbow firmly but surprisingly gently. You can continue arguing, but sitting down. Do you enjoy commanding wounded employees? Only the extremely stubborn ones who bleed my signal marker. He helped me lower myself onto a flat piece of plastic. I tried to move my foot away from him, but he gently but firmly grabbed my ankle, as carefully as if I were made of the finest glass. The cut was deep, blood quickly staining the snow, but the tendons were intact. Still, when his thumb gently brushed the remaining ice and dirt from my skin, my breath caught sharply. He froze, not letting go of my leg. Did it hurt? No. Then why did you stop breathing? Because your hands are cold. My hands are warm, Vivienne, so you're cold inside. It's probably transmitted through your skin. He stared at me for several endless seconds, then silently began to apply antiseptic to the cut. His concentration was terrifying. My entire world in that moment narrowed to the movement of his fingers, the burn of the medicine, and the warmth of his palm supporting my heel. A billionaire from a shadowy syndicate, kneeling in the snow and bandaging my leg with a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. It should have looked absurd, but it looked intimate, so intimate that I had no idea how to resist it. You shouldn't have ruined your shirt, I said quietly. I have experienced more serious losses. For example? His fingers froze for a split second. Childhood. I waited for him to continue, but the door slammed in my face before a single word could escape. He carefully tied a knot in the bandage and released my leg. Don't step on it unless necessary. Yes, sir. Be careful. I might start to enjoy your obedience. If this happens, I will simply leave on foot through this pass. This time he actually laughed. A quiet, unfamiliar laugh that completely transformed his expression. It shocked me so much that I forgot to look away. Gideon Blackwood had a stunning smile, simply because it looked like something he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. He seemed to realize it too. The smile instantly vanished, replaced by his usual sternness, and I caught myself thinking something terrible. I missed that smile, and I hated myself even more for feeling that way. The second night was much colder than the first. The mountains, which had seemed dazzlingly beautiful in the daylight, turned into an icy hell with the onset of darkness. The wind became damp and sharp. We had a good fire, a fortified shelter, a supply of water, and half a packed lunch. Gideon insisted on strict rationing. I accused him of being overly dramatic, until hunger twisted my stomach so much that I no longer even wanted to joke. He handed me most of the rations. I noticed it immediately. Hunger makes any injustice all too noticeable. Divide it equally, I said. No, eat. You need strength. You have a shoulder injury and blood loss. You need your strength just as much. My body is larger. I have more internal reserves. Is this a polite way of reminding me again that I am smaller and weaker? It's simply a statement of physical facts, and precision saves resources. He leaned back against the concrete wall of the pillbox, the orange glow of the fire highlighting the bronze tint on his cheekbones. I broke the piece of ration in half and forced one part into his palm. Then don't argue and just eat. I don't relish the prospect of having to carry your huge functional body if you faint. He looked silently at the food in his palm and then took it. A fair deal, the same words as yesterday but spoken much more softly. An icy wind howled through the pillbox's opening. I pulled his coat tighter around me, then glanced at his bare arms. He was trembling slightly. Not overtly. Blackwood would rather bleed to death in front of the board of directors than admit he was cold. But the little things gave him away. His clenched fingers, his stony shoulders, and the twitching muscles in his jaw. I watched him for about a minute, until anger rose in my chest again. You are cold. I'm fine. You're shaking. The wind got stronger, that's all. Your arrogance is stronger than your common sense. I stood up, walked around the fire, and sat down on the concrete floor right next to him, still wearing my coat. He slowly turned his head, a silent question in his eyes. What are you doing? I'm trying to survive in your language. I opened one half of my heavy coat and threw it over his shoulder. His body instantly turned to stone. He froze, barely breathing. Vivienne, don't start a game you're not ready to finish. He returned my phrase from 2 years ago. For a few seconds, we sat absolutely still. Then he slowly relaxed, allowing the heavy fabric to cover us both. Our shoulders touched. A dense, almost tangible warmth instantly flowed from him to me. The fire crackled. Snow rustled outside the bunker walls. I stared straight ahead, pretending my heart hadn't started pounding in a crazy, ragged rhythm. You didn't have to do that, his voice said quietly in my ear. I know. Then why? I turned my gaze to the dancing tongues of flame. Because on this mountain you would do the same for me. A heavy, thick silence hung in the air. That's too dangerous an assumption, Vivienne. No, I shook my head. It's just a very inconvenient truth for you. He leaned his head back against the concrete wall and closed his eyes. I saw his Adam's apple bob in his throat as he swallowed. You must hate me. I hate it. It's just that it's incredibly ineffective right now. You're tired. This explains most of my mistakes. I should have moved away, returned to my side of the fire, but I stayed. His shoulders slowly relaxed against mine. I felt the precise moment when his iron discipline finally gave way to the need for warmth. It wasn't trust, that was still far off, but rather a capitulation forced by sheer exhaustion, and at that realization, my chest tightened with a strange, dull ache. That day, in your office, I said quietly, before my courage failed me, when I begged for help, did you even think about my brother once after I left? His eyes slowly opened, the fire reflected in his pupils as two small dots. Yes. I waited for him to continue, but he fell silent again. Is that all? Is that your complete answer? Why do you always avoid giving direct explanations? Is this another way to avoid guilt? Maybe. His honesty cut deeper than any icy refusal. I turned my whole body towards him, throwing off part of my coat. You humiliated me in front of your partners. His face tightened painfully. I know. You made me feel that asking for the life of a loved one to be saved is shameful and pathetic. I know, Vivienne, and you let me hate you for 2 years without ever trying to explain yourself. My voice broke into a tremor. Why did you do this? A figure appeared from the darkness behind him. No, it was an illusion. Gideon looked at me with a gaze that for the first time lacked his usual iron armor. Because that day, 3 people sat in my office, searching for any weakness to destroy my empire. If they'd found out your family meant anything to me, your brother wouldn't have survived until morning, right there on the operating table. The rescuers who arrived that night were hired by me through shell accounts in Zurich. I paid them $3 million to extract him secretly, and without a trace. The whole world around me seemed to freeze. So for you? He closed his eyes tiredly. Your work mattered. Your dedication mattered. Your life outside my office meant far more than you could possibly understand. Anger flared up in me again, but now it was mixed with a wild, suffocating pain. And that's why you decided to trample me to protect me? I made a cruel choice because I believed that pure cruelty would be a more effective armor for you. She wasn't armor. She was a scar that didn't heal for 2 years. I know. His gaze returned to my face, and the depth of pain in his eyes was so open that it physically hurt me. It was a mistake. One word of honor. No strategies, no excuses, no attempts to save face. I rose to my feet because I suddenly couldn't breathe in this tiny pillbox. The wind whistled through the doorway, and my injured leg throbbed with pain. Do you even understand what you did to me? I understand this every day when you come into my office, Vivienne. Then why did you remain silent all this time? His voice dropped to a barely audible whisper. Because I didn't know how to stand in front of you without that monster mask that you had already so sincerely believed in. That sentence knocked the last breath out of my anger. I turned and walked outside into the icy morning before tears could betray my weakness. The mountains looked wounded after the storm. The wind had died down, the sun was slowly rising over the peaks, painting the snow a blinding white. Our titanium cross in the snow was half buried. The world sparkled so pure and indifferent, as if it hadn't tried to destroy us that night. Gideon followed a few minutes later, more slowly than usual, clutching his wounded arm to his body. We need to update the marker, he said. You need rest. The rescuers won't come because I'm lying on a piece of plastic. They also won't come if you fall here dead. Trying to prove your omnipotence to the sky. He looked at me for a long moment. I'm not proving anything to anyone. Excellent. The mountain range has seen richer Blackwoods. A tiny smile touched his lips again. Then his gaze shifted further up the slope, to where a sheer rocky ridge rose above the forest. A high point. If we move the mirror marker there and light a signal fire with thick smoke, our chances will triple. Your shoulder can barely move. You won't be able to get up there. So, you will have to do most of the work. It sounded almost like absolute trust. There's no need to make an event out of this, I repeated, but a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread inside me. We spent the entire first half of the day trudging through deep snow to the top of the ridge. My injured leg made every step a torture. His shoulder made every movement dangerous. But we moved together, not smoothly, not perfectly, but in that ragged rhythm we never had in the office. He supported me on the slippery rocks with his good arm, and I carried the heavy container so he wouldn't pretend the pain was just a token. Halfway up the climb, I slipped on an icy ledge. Gideon reacted instantly, catching me by the waist and pulling me close, my hands pressed against his chest. For a second, everything disappeared. The mountains, the helicopter, the fear, the cold. His face was inches from mine. Drops of melted snow froze on his eyelashes. Careful, he breathed, his voice low and broken. I'm careful. No, you're desperate. That's different. I couldn't bring myself to look away. Do you often compliment your engineers? Only to those who pull me out of the burning rubble. A fair deal? No, his answer was instant, quiet, and deadly to my armor. Some debts cannot be settled by ordinary payment. The air between us had completely changed. My palms still felt the beating of his heart. His hands still clutched my waist. If I made one fleeting movement forward, there would be no return to the old hatred. Gideon seemed to understand this as well as I did. Vivienne, his voice sounded like a warning to himself. Don't look at me like I'm better than I am. Then stop trying to prove me wrong. My voice sounded much softer than I had intended. For a brief moment, I thought he was going to kiss me. I felt this attraction, wild, overwhelming, defying any logical analysis. But the next moment, I gently pulled away, not because I didn't want it, but because I wanted it too much. And trusting him before I fully understood him seemed like another catastrophe. Gideon released me immediately. No anger, no pressure, only a shadow of disappointment crossed his face. "You're right," he said quietly. "In what? It's too early." This unexpected delicacy of his almost destroyed me completely. We reached the top of the ridge by midday. From here, our mountain seemed tiny and terrifying. The snowy plateau stretched to the horizon, ending in jagged cliffs. The feeling of our absolute isolation washed over me with renewed vigor. Down there by the pillbox, I'd thought we controlled the space. Here, I saw that we were just 2 grains of sand on the white canvas of eternal winter. Gideon arranged the mirror shards in a circle, directing the sunbeams toward the valley, and secured pieces of white insulation between the stones. I collected dry brushwood while he prepared the base for the fire. "If a helicopter comes, we'll use a mirror," he coordinated the movements. "If we spot a search party below, we'll set fire to the damp branches. We need thick smoke. What if no one comes?" I secured the last strap. He stuck a piece of plastic with white fabric between the stones, like the flag of our small garrison. "So, we will continue to live here until this happens." I looked at his profile, at the bruises, the dried blood, and that stubborn, unwilling expression on his face. "You talk about survival so easily. There's nothing complicated about it, Vivienne. It's just very narrow. What does it mean? One task at a time, 1 hour, 1 step, 1 breath. Panic tries to take over the entire future. Survival denies it this right." I remembered Leo's hospital room, the beeping of the monitors, and the bills I had no money to pay. That feeling when one specific hour becomes the whole world because fear narrows your consciousness to a point. "This is the first really useful thing you have taught me in 2 years. I will try not to spoil this historical moment." We worked until the sun disappeared behind the gathering clouds again, and just as we began our descent, my injured foot slipped on an icy rock. I was thrown toward the steep cliff, where the sharp rocks of the gorge loomed far below. Gideon leaped into an impossible position. His good hand clamped tightly around my wrist. The sudden movement completely tore the muscles in his injured shoulder. I heard that terrible dull sound he couldn't suppress. He pulled me back with a wild, inhuman effort, but the rotting ice crust beneath his own feet couldn't hold. He fell, sliding headlong toward the edge of the cliff. "Gideon," I fell to my knees, grabbing his hand with both of my palms. His body froze half a meter from the edge. His boots hung suspended in the void. One hand gripped a crevice in the rock, the other, injured, hung limp. Blackwood's face turned deathly white. "Let go." My left hand he forced out through clenched teeth. "You can't hold me. The crust is creeping." "I won't let anything go." "Vivienne, listen to me." "No, you won't fly down alone. Look at me." My leg burned like hell, my ribs screamed in pain. My palms slid across the wet ice. Down there, deep beneath him, the wind howled through the rocks as if demanding its toll. Gideon looked up at me, and for the first time in all the time I'd known him, his gaze showed genuine, uncontrollable fear, but not for himself. For me. "If I pull you along..." "Let go, Vivienne. That's an order." "Stop ordering me to die without you." Fury flared within me like a pure, blinding flame. These words caused his face to change. I braced my knees against the rocky outcrop, grabbed his wrist tightly with both hands, and pulled upward with all the strength I had left in my exhausted body. He helped himself with his good leg, clinging to the rocky outcroppings. Inch by inch, overcoming the excruciating pain, we pulled his body from the abyss. When he finally tumbled over the edge onto a safe ledge, I collapsed onto the snow next to him, shaking so violently my teeth chattered. For a few minutes, we simply lay there in silence. The wind howled over the gorge as if genuinely disappointed by our rescue. Gideon slowly turned his head towards me. His breathing was heavy and ragged, sweat mixed with dirt and blood on his cheek. "You saved me again." I looked at the gray sky because looking at it was beyond my strength right now. "Stop giving me reasons to do this. I'm trying. Try harder." A soft sound like a faint laugh escaped his chest. Then the pain completely doubled him over. I sat up and saw dark blood gushing from beneath the bandage on his shoulder. Panic washed over me instantly. "We need to go down urgently. Give me a minute." "We don't have this minute. You're bleeding." "Vivienne, no. You have no right to die here after you made me trust you again." The words flew out of my mouth before I could even process them. Gideon froze. Even exhausted, even weakened by pain, he caught the phrase in his stride. His gray eyes pierced mine feverishly. "Believe it?" My throat tightened. I wanted to take those words back, to pass them off as anger, as shock, as another harshness, but I couldn't. Not after that precipice, not after his hands that held me over the abyss, not after the terrible panic that had gripped me a second ago. I pressed my palm hard to his bleeding shoulder and turned away. "Shut up and breathe." His dirty, scratched palm covered my fingers for a brief second, not to remove them or seize control, just to feel that I was there. "I'm breathing," he said quietly, "because you told me to." I hated how close to complete trust that sounded. We descended back to the pillbox for an interminable time. My arm supported him around the waist, his good arm rested on my shoulders. Every step caused excruciating pain for both of us. Neither of us uttered a sound. Our shelter awaited us below, ugly, half destroyed, but it had become our only fortress. When we finally reached the camp, Gideon was barely able to stand. I helped him down onto a piece of plastic in the back of the pillbox and immediately knelt next to him. His eyes were half-lidded, his face drained of color. But when I reached for the water bottle, he grabbed my wrist. "Your leg first." I almost laughed out loud from sheer utter exhaustion. "You are unbearable, unyielding, stubborn, and alive." I looked at him, this icy billionaire, stripped of his power, money, and suits by this mountain, leaving only blood, heat, stubbornness, and that insane willingness to sacrifice himself for me. And I felt the last piece of my 2-year-old hatred finally crumble and turn to dust. In its place, something entirely new arose, frightening in its power, because I didn't yet have a name for it. I gave him some water, pressed fresh gauze to his wounded shoulder, and sat beside him as the white sun slowly sank behind the cold alpine ridge. This mountain had taken our helicopter, our confidence, our safe distance, and almost taken our lives. But it had left us this fire, this squalid shelter, and a truth I could no longer deny. I truly hated Gideon Blackwood as we fell from that damn sky. But somewhere between the fire, the storm, the icy shelter, and the edge of this cliff, hating him became much more difficult than simply holding his hand. The first rescue helicopter flew over us without noticing our marker. I was kneeling next to Gideon in the dim light of the pillbox, changing the cold bandage on his fever-scorched shoulder, when that distinctive, heavy hum of the blades cut through the frosty valley air. At first I thought the mountains were mocking me again. The whistling of the wind in the crevices had often seemed like human voices to me. The rustling of the snow on the slope, the footsteps of rescuers. Hunger, cold, and panic had already taught my mind to skillfully lie. But then Gideon's eyes snapped open. "A helicopter," he exhaled. I raised my head and saw through the pillbox's opening the silhouette of a heavy search vehicle, moving slowly above the spruce treetops far below. For a second, I froze. Rescue seemed too unreal, too painful to believe. Gideon tried to prop himself up on one elbow and immediately groaned softly, sinking back down. "Mirror!" he shouted. I grabbed a shard of plastic mirror from our meager supplies and rushed outside onto the open, snowy slope. My injured leg exploded with pain with every movement, but I ran. "Over here!" I screamed at the top of my lungs, waving my arms wildly and sending short, furious flashes of sunlight towards the retreating car. "We're here! Look over here!" The helicopter continued moving. It didn't turn around. It didn't slow down. Its silhouette grew smaller, quieter, until the frosty haze of the horizon completely swallowed it. My hand slowly dropped. The silence that returned to the gorge after that sound felt much heavier than the moment the helicopter crashed. Behind me, Gideon tried to get to his feet and collapsed in the snow. I managed to turn around and caught his body, and we both rolled into the snowdrift, landing on our knees. "They didn't see us," I said quietly, hating how small and helpless my own voice sounded. His breathing was heavy. His skin literally burned under my fingers, but his gray eyes remained fixed on the empty sky. "So next time we'll make them see us." "What if there is no next time?" "There's always the next task, Vivienne." "I'm tired of tasks, Gideon." His gaze slowly moved to my face, cleared of its usual commanding tone, pride, and corporate armor. Me too. His terrifying honesty nearly broke me completely. I sat down next to him in the snow, our shoulders touching, the dying fire between us, the indifferent white peaks stretching around us. For the first time since the disaster, Gideon Blackwood didn't tell me what to do. He didn't plan, calculate rations, create schedules, or translate our fear into clear instructions. He simply leaned his head back against the concrete wall of the pillbox and closed his eyes, too exhausted to continue pretending to be omnipotent. I looked at him, at the terrible bruises on his ribs, at the dried blood on his temple, at the bandage I had myself applied to his mangled shoulder. This mountain had successively taken from him first his title, then his impeccable suit, then his distance, and finally his iron silence. Beneath it all, he still remained a dangerous, proud, and incredibly strong man. But he also turned out to be the man who all these days had given me most of his water, shielded me from the icy wind with his body, endured his pain as a normal part of his work, and whispered truths that the fever had torn from the darkest depths of his soul. I genuinely hated the fact that the helicopter had flown past, but I hated even more the terrible, selfish thought that flashed through my mind as I looked at the empty sky. If they take us back to Zurich, will I lose this version of him to his shadow empire? That night, his fever returned with renewed vigor. I rebuilt the fire with trembling hands, feeding it plastic and kindling, and used the last remnants of clean cloth to cool his forehead with melted snow. He thrashed about in a daze, speaking a mixture of German and English, shouting names I'd never heard in the conglomerate's office. At some point before dawn, his eyes opened, and such a crystalline, terrifying clarity appeared in them that my heart sank. "If we go back," he said quietly but firmly, "don't let them make you feel small." "To whom?" "To my world. Your world no longer frightens me, Gideon. It should be scary. He scared me to the point of this mountain. I looked at his fingers, which suddenly found my palm in the dim light, and squeezed it. His grip was weak, but he held on as if he needed my official permission to let go. Now I know that his master can also draw blood. A tiny smile touched his dry lips. You will use this against me at the next board meeting. At the first opportunity, Blackwood. Don't even doubt it. His thumb brushed gently across my knuckles once. Great. After that, he fell asleep and I sat awake, watching for dawn. Just before the first rays of light, I made a decision. We couldn't just wait. We needed a signal that would truly split the sky. I gathered a bunch of damp spruce branches, scraps of rubber cable insulation, and scraps of plastic helicopter skin. Gideon said the black chemical smoke lingered in the air much longer than usual. I worked until my palms were bloody and calloused. When he opened his eyes, I expected a burst of anger for acting without his command, but he simply watched me silently from the dim light of the pillbox, and there was something deep, quiet, and unanalyzable in his gaze. You've made a great smoke cannon, he remarked. I listened carefully when you lectured me on survival. This is very dangerous. For whom? For anyone who dares to underestimate you in my presence. I tried to smile, but my throat was constricted by the tears that were welling up. Did you underestimate me? Yes, and I have no excuse for it. It was a stupid calculation. I knelt down next to him and handed him the lid of water. And now? He took the container and took a sip, never taking his gray gaze off mine. And now I am seriously afraid that you will turn out to be much stronger than me. It's not fear, Gideon. It's simply common sense you've finally come to. He laughed quietly, weakly, but absolutely sincerely, and 2 hours later we saw a search party. They appeared on the opposite slope of the gorge, tiny orange dots of rescuers on the blinding white snow. Gideon forced himself to his feet, but he was swaying, and I instantly grabbed him by the waist. Together, supporting each other, we made our way to our smoke cannon on the rocky ledge. Every movement was excruciatingly painful. My leg was torn apart. His body grew heavier with every step. I ignited the dry fabric. The lithium battery produced a powerful spark, the dry branches burst into flames, and then the damp pine needles and rubber emitted a colossal, thick column of black smoke that stubbornly rose into the clear alpine sky. Gideon grabbed the shard of mirror with his good hand and began sending directed beams of light toward the orange dots, slowly, rhythmically, expertly. Keep throwing rubber, he coordinated. More branches. I know, Gideon. If you give me one more order, I will personally throw you off this ledge and into the hands of your rescue team. The corner of his mouth curled up. A fair threat. The orange dots on the other side of the ravine stopped, and then they abruptly changed direction, rushing towards us. My knees instantly buckled with relief. His good arm pressed me tightly to his side. Whether to support me or to steady himself, I couldn't tell. They see us, I whispered, not believing my eyes. They really see us. Yes, his low voice sounded right next to my ear. I told you we'd make them do it. The rescue itself unfolded in a blur. The screams of men in orange jackets, the roar of approaching Blackwood Industries helicopters, the stretcher, the doctor's endless questions, to which I had no answers. They draped a heavy thermal blanket over my shoulders, though I still refused to remove his tattered, soot-stained coat. When the rescuers tried to lift me onto the stretcher first, I clung tenaciously to Gideon's wrist. Together, I said crisply. The doctor looked at me in bewilderment and tried to explain that Mr. Blackwood would be on the next plane. I shook my head furiously, causing everything to swim before my eyes. No, only together. Gideon looked down at my hand, clutching his. Something subtly changed on his face. Something too personal, too intimate for all these strangers filling our gorge. Vivienne, fly away. Don't start this here. You are wounded. You too. You're the first. No more, Blackwood. That balance of power remains there, on that mountain. We only survived that week because we absolutely refused to let each other disappear. Gideon looked at me for a few seconds, then nodded almost imperceptibly to the doctors. Together, he confirmed. We left this mountain the same way we survived on it, one hand clenched tightly in the other, and too stubborn to let go. The private clinic in Zurich was deafening with its noise after the frosty silence of the cliffs, the beeping of machines, the rustling of the staff's footsteps, the endless examinations. The doctors treated my leg, tightly bandaged my ribs, examined my head, and unanimously declared how incredibly lucky I was. But I knew this luck had a name, the pounding of my heart and the smell of fire in my hair. Gideon was immediately taken to the operating suite on another floor. His shoulder required major surgery, and fever and exhaustion were making it worse. It was the first time in a week that we had been separated. Panic rose in my chest so quickly that I almost pulled the IV out of my vein. A nurse gently grabbed my hand and quietly said, "He's on the 3rd floor. Sir Blackwood is in surgery. Everything is under control." But that 3rd floor at that moment felt like a different continent. 2 days later, I saw him again, through the glass partition of the VIP room. He was sitting on the bed, pale, with his shoulder immobilized. He wore a snow-white shirt instead of the tattered black one. His face was clear, but the mask of a stone titan had returned. 4 men in expensive dark suits stood around him. His world had returned to him in its entirety. Lawyers Advisors, security chiefs, silent men with predatory eyes, catching every movement of his fingers. Gideon Blackwood was once again among those who feared him, and I saw the mountains rapidly disappear from his face. He spotted me through the glass. For a brief second, his mask cracked, his gray eyes warming. But the next moment, an older man with perfectly gray hair and a suit that cost more than my entire life blocked my path. Arthur Vance, chief consigliere of the Blackwood Empire, a close friend of his late father, the man who personally helped transform a broken boy into a ruthless titan before whom the market trembled. He looked at me through the glass as if I were dirty snow accidentally stuck to his boss's shoe. "Miss Mercer," he said icily. "I'm glad to see you're recovering. Sir Blackwood has provided you with the best specialists. Can I come in to see him?" Sir Blackwood is currently busy resolving critical issues at the conglomerate that have been idle for a week. His gaze remained absolutely impenetrable. "You must understand one simple thing, Miss Mercer. The extreme conditions of the mountains create the illusion of a unique connection. Fear, cold, isolation, shared trauma, all of these things cause people to confuse survival instincts with something more personal. But Blackwood cannot afford such vulnerability here in Zurich." My fingers tightened around the edge of the hospital gown. "Did Gideon ask you to tell me this?" "Sir Blackwood is too busy to think about it, but I must think for him. A man in his position has no right to weakness. If his competitors see he has something they can use as leverage, his empire will be torn apart within a week. On this mountain, you saw Blackwood without his name. But here, his name feeds thousands of families and keeps in fear those who, without a powerful monster over their heads, would instantly turn into predators. If you truly value his life, do not ask him to become someone this world will destroy that very day." After Vance left, I remained sitting on the bed, feeling the mountains finally recede into the background. Perhaps the old consigliere was right. Perhaps. Out there in the snow, everything simply seemed brighter and sharper than it actually was. Perhaps Gideon was only gentle because there was no one around to punish him for his humanity. In the evening, the nurse brought me discharge papers and an archive folder with my old medical records. "Your brother Leo has called 3 times already," she smiled. "We assured him that you are completely safe." I idly flipped through papers while the nurse checked my leg bandage. Suddenly, from the depths of the folder, an old financial report from 2 years ago fell onto my bed, an official internal audit of Blackwood Industries. Leo's hospital expenses after the mine collapse were entirely covered by Blackwood's personal fund. This didn't surprise me. I knew he'd paid for it later. But what caught my eye was an appendix on the second page. "Secret transaction, special evacuation team, route Alps mine ravines, status, completed funding source, Sir G. Blackwood's personal closed account. Transfer time 23:45, that very night, that very hour when I stood in his office," and he hurled words about production efficiency in my face. He paid for those mercenaries before I even had time to reach the restroom to sob into my hands. He saved Leo that very night, deliberately making me believe in his absolute, exemplary cruelty. My hands instantly froze. My 2-year-old anger turned upside down, losing its familiar safe form. I was out of bed before the nurse could even scream. I was walking down the clinic hallway in hospital socks, a tight bandage on my ribs, and a loose sweater left behind by someone from Blackwood's security. 2 guards outside his room immediately blocked my path. "Miss Mercer, Sir Blackwood is resting before an important conference call. Let me through." "That's impossible. We have orders from Mr. Vance." I peered through the glass partition. Gideon was sitting on the edge of the bed, Arthur Vance scolding him harshly, holding a clipboard. Gideon's face was pale, his shoulder rigid, and his eyes darker than the stormy sky. He looked up and saw me through the glass. I pressed the financial order against the partition. Something in his expression told me he understood everything. "Let her in." His low voice came through the door intercom clearly. The guards reluctantly stepped aside. Arthur Vance turned sharply as I entered, his entire being radiating absolute icy displeasure. I ignored him. "You paid for this special squad 2 years ago." I put the paper on his table. Gideon rose slowly from his bed. "Vivienne, you can't go without shoes." "Shut up, Blackwood." I demand a straight answer. Yes or no? Yes, I did it. This word finally destroyed the remnants of my previous reality. "You paid for Leo's rescue 15 minutes after you called me worthless and refused to help me in front of your partner?" "Yes." "And you allowed me to hate you for 2 years, knowing what hell I went through?" "Yes." My voice broke into a tremor. Tears burned my eyes. Why did you do this to me?" Arthur Vance stepped forward. "Miss Mercer, this is no place for personal scenes." Gideon didn't even turn his head in his direction. "Come out, Arthur. We need to talk alone." "Gideon, the board meeting starts in 20 minutes. Get out. Right now." The old man gritted his teeth but complied, and the icy door closed behind him. We were left alone in the room, which smelled of sterile cleanliness instead of the smoke of our fire. The mountains seemed unreal from here. "Speak," I demanded. Gideon looked down at his bandaged hand. There were 3 people sitting in my office that day, 2 of whom were spies for Borza's rival syndicate. They were looking for any clue, any vulnerability in my circle, to use as leverage. If I had shown you even a shred of leniency, if I had openly ordered your brother's rescue. Leo would never have made it to the hospital. Borza would have intercepted him right from under the rubble to dictate the terms of the Blackwood Industries encryption codes to me. I had to crush you before them, show them you were nothing to me. A hollow message. The mercenaries received the contract through a blind Swiss proxy. They didn't even know who they were working for. And that's why you decided to destroy my pride to save his life? It was the only way to guarantee his safety. I made that choice. You did it for me. You made me feel like a nobody asking for help.
I know, Vivienne. Stop saying you know. You could have told me in a week, in a month. I tried. His gray eyes lifted, an unfamiliar, frightening, damp melancholy frozen in them.
3 days after the operation, I stood at the door of your room. I watched through the glass as you laughed on the phone with Leo. You looked so free, so relieved. And I realized that if I walked through that door, I would bring this whole nightmare back with me, forever linking your brother's salvation to my face. And I turned and left. It wasn't your choice, Gideon. You constantly make decisions for me and call it protection. I took a step towards him, tears already choking me. You did the same on this mountain. You gave me water, rations, your coat, shielded me from the blast, and then pretended it was simply efficient resource management. You don't have the right to decide on your own what your concern means, and hide the truth just because genuine honesty scares you more than your entire shadow syndicate. Gideon looked at me as if every word I said was peeling away layers of his years of armor faster than a plane crash. Yes, I was afraid. This confession made me shut up. What? That you will see the real me, without my money, without my empire, without my bodyguards, and still choose to hate me. My breathing finally stopped. He took one slow, cautious step toward me, not trying to touch me, leaving the choice in this tiny space between us. On that mountain, I had nothing but who I truly am. No power over the sky, no conglomerate. You saw me weak, wounded, bleeding, useful only because I flatly refused to let you die. And that scared me far less than that sterile room in Zurich. Why? Because here I can very easily turn back into that monster that you so habitually hate. This truth crashed down on me with all its crushing force. I wanted to hug him. I wanted to punch him in the chest. I wanted that cold rock back because the pain there was so much simpler and more understandable. Then don't turn, I whispered. His face tightened painfully. It's not that simple, Vivienne. My world will call you my greatest weakness. I am not weak. They will use you to test my strength. Let them try. They will attack every border I decide to soften for you. Then build stronger boundaries, Blackwood. But never again try to die within yourself and call it strength. He turned away, breathing hard through the pain in his shoulder that he would have hidden from any other person on this planet. Vance has convened an emergency board meeting downstairs. The syndicate captains and investors are awaiting my arrival. They want official confirmation that what happened in the Alps was merely a technical incident of survival, which will in no way affect the strict governance of Blackwood Industries. My chest went cold. And this is what you are going to tell them? He didn't answer right away, and that pause hurt me. I took a step back toward the door. Don't try to protect me with more lies, Gideon. If you choose your mask, be honest about it. I survived a fall from a height of 3,000 meters. I can survive your truth, too. I turned around and walked out of the room before he could stop me. The next evening, I attended a private reception at the Blackwoods country estate outside Zurich, because fleeing would mean Arthur Vance was absolutely right. A vast mansion of white stone and glass towered over the lake behind tall wrought iron gates. Men in black suits silently watched my approach. Not a single one of them blocked my path. Gideon must have given orders to that effect. Or perhaps they all simply wanted to see the woman who had returned with him from that accursed peak before she was erased from his history forever. The boardroom was vast, cold, and dazzlingly luxurious. 12 of the conglomerate's most powerful and dangerous men sat around a long, fumed oak table. Arthur Vance stood to the right of the central chair. Gideon was once again wearing his impeccable black suit, his shoulder brace artfully concealed beneath the cut of his jacket. I was the only one in the entire room who knew the titanic effort and pain it had cost him to maintain that perfect posture. His gray eyes found me the moment I stepped through the door, and the entire room turned their heads in unison to follow his gaze. No one said a word. I calmly walked to the empty chair at the very end of the long table. "Miss Mercer," Arthur Vance's icy voice cut through the silence. "This is a closed meeting of the Blackwood conglomerate shareholders. Your security reports have already been reviewed." "Then you shouldn't have made me a key part of your agenda, Mr. Vance." Several people at the table exchanged tense glances. Gideon's expression didn't change, but that warm light that only I could read blazed in his eyes. The old consigliere turned to Blackwood. "Gideon, this matter must be settled once and for all. Mountains breed dangerous emotional illusions. Gratitude, fear, shared trauma. All of this is understandable from the perspective of crisis psychology. But the Blackwood conglomerate cannot be run by someone who makes emotional mistakes. We need absolute clarity." I felt the heavy gaze of every predator in this room. Once this hall would have made me cower. Now I remembered the edge of the cliff and his palm slipping from the icy crust. I remembered the black smoke, the fever, and the stubborn pounding of his heart next to my ear. I stopped fearing this world the moment I saw its strongest man bleeding in my arms. An emotional mistake, I repeated clearly, looking straight at Vance. His gaze was murderous. That's right, Miss Mercer. I turned my gaze to Gideon. Is this who I am to you, Sir Blackwood? The question wasn't part of the board's rules, but the entire room literally held its breath in anticipation of the answer. Gideon rose slowly from his chair. Pain momentarily contorted his features before he buried it beneath his iron discipline. No, one short word, and the air in the boardroom instantly changed. Vance's jaw clenched. Think carefully, Gideon. The conglomerate's merger is at stake. Gideon's eyes never left my face. I haven't thought about anything else since our disaster, Arthur. Then remember who you are. Gideon walked slowly around the table. I remember perfectly well who I am. I am a man who fell from this sky, unarmed, unguarded, without an empire, and without a name that meant nothing to this mountain. Up there, my conglomerate didn't warm me. My billions didn't light a fire. My reputation didn't protect me from the icy wind. She did all that. A dead, deafening silence fell over the room. Gideon stopped a step away from me. She saved my life when leaving me to die on that slope was the easiest and most logical decision for her. She cared for me when I gave her every reason to hate me. She looked at the worst version of me, wounded, weak, helpless, and she didn't turn away. Vance's voice dropped to a hissing whisper. Human feelings make a leader vulnerable and predictable to enemies, Gideon. I had never spoken at a Blackwood board meeting before this day, but now my voice came out before my mind could block it out. A leader incapable of human emotion is already dead, and his empire is nothing but a crypt. The answer struck like thunder. Some shareholders looked genuinely offended. Others quickly looked away. Gideon looked at me as if I'd just placed the most powerful weapon on the planet in his hands and called it salvation. Vance had completely lost his luster. His face was covered in red spots. You completely misunderstand the nature of true power, Miss Mercer. No. I shook my head, rising from my seat. I understand the nature of fear perfectly well, and in this room, I see 12 men who call their fear loyalty to the conglomerate. One of the young directors jerked, as if about to shout an insult. Gideon, without turning around, said curtly, "Sit." He instantly sank back into the chair. Gideon extended his good hand to me, slowly giving me every opportunity to refuse. I didn't. The moment our fingers intertwined, all the sternness vanished from his face, giving way to pure, absolute truth. I've spent my whole life making people afraid of me. Vivienne, he said quietly, but his voice was clearly heard by everyone in the room. And you were the first person who made me truly afraid of losing myself. My eyes burned unbearably from the tears that were welling up. I truly hated your icy silence, Gideon. I know. I hated the cruelty that you deliberately forced me to believe in for 2 years. I know, Vivienne, and I'm still very angry at you for it. Okay. His thumb gently ran over my knuckles, just like it had in the crashing helicopter. Be angry with me, but never cross the fire again. Something inside my chest finally gave in and melted. Not all the pain, not all the memories of his glass office, not the 2 years I carried that scar alone. Forgiveness isn't a door that opens with a single click. It's a long, arduous journey through the snow. And we were only at the very beginning. But there was love here too. Impossible, irrational, defying any laws of industrial efficiency. Love that grew not from perfection, but from the wreckage of a helicopter, wet snow, the heat of a fever, and a conscious choice to stay close. I loved you long before I was ready to forgive you completely, I whispered so quietly that only he could hear. Gideon closed his eyes for a second, as if the words simultaneously caused him excruciating pain and healed all his old scars. Then he gently pressed his forehead to mine, completely ignoring the conglomerate's shocked board of directors. No theatrical gestures, no pathos. Just his hot breath, absolute closeness, and a truth that proved far stronger than any shadowy syndicate. Arthur Vance didn't say another word. The boardroom was silent. For years, they had all obeyed the coldest and most ruthless man in Europe without question. This evening, for the first time, they met the man behind that mask, and none of them knew what to make of it. 3 weeks later, Gideon brought me to the lake, but not to the mountains. The doctors unanimously insisted that neither of us should climb high enough yet, and we ourselves were perhaps not yet ready to return to the gorge that had nearly become our common grave. Instead, he brought me to a quiet, sunlit pier at dawn, far from the press cameras, bodyguards, and stuffy offices of Blackwood Industries. My brother, Leo, was recovering in a country house, still grumbling about how I'd kept the details of the disaster from him, but there were tears in his eyes when Gideon came to him personally to apologize face to face. He didn't send expensive baskets of flowers through his assistants. He simply stood in our small kitchen, too large for the space, and quietly said, "Leo, I made a terrible mistake with your sister when she needed my honesty most." My brother studied him for a long moment, then replied, "Yes, Blackwood, you acted like complete and utter bastard." And Gideon accepted this verdict with absolute silent dignity. It was in that moment that I knew he truly intended to change. The pier smelled of lake water and morning freshness. Gideon was wearing a simple black shirt. The brace had already been removed from his shoulder, though his movements were still slightly constrained. I wore a light-colored dress, fluttering in the breeze. For the first time, there were no analytical charts, safety plans, fires to extinguish, or people awaiting his stern orders between us. He reached into his trouser pocket and carefully dropped something into my open palm. It was a small, perfectly polished piece of black titanium, curved and with jagged fracture edges. "What is this?" I asked, turning it over with my fingers. "A fragment of our helicopter's tail rotor? I found it in my coat pocket after the evacuation. Why did you keep it? It's absolutely useless. Just a piece of burnt metal." Gideon turned his gray gaze to the golden surface of the lake. "Because every day he reminds me of that morning when I lost absolutely everything that made me untouchable for this world." I squeezed my fingers tightly around the cold titanium and took a step closer to it. "No, Gideon, he's reminding you of that morning when you finally became reachable." He looked at me, and his usual sternness hadn't completely vanished from his eyes. It never would. Blackwood had lived too long in rooms where any human leniency was instantly met with brutal punishment. But now, when the silence hung between us, it no longer felt like the armored wall of his office. Sometimes it simply became a free space where our truth could breathe. "Are you afraid?" he asked quietly, covering my hand with his. "You? Us." I looked at the endless lake, the water sparkling in the first rays of the sun, no longer reminding me of the abyss. "Yes, I'm afraid." His fingers intertwined more tightly with mine. "Good. Fear gives strength. What should I do with it?" I smiled despite myself. "Use it? No." His low, deep voice rang out with absolute, unshakable certainty. "Share it with me." The sun rose higher, painting the world around us pure gold. I remembered the woman I'd been on that crashing helicopter, sitting across from the man she so sincerely hated, absolutely certain he had no heart because he'd once mercilessly shattered her own. I remembered the crash, the bonfire, the ice storm, his feverish nocturnal confessions, the cliff edge, the evacuation, and that boardroom where he'd deliberately torn off his mask in front of people who worshipped only his cruelty. I truly hated Gideon Blackwood before we fell from that sky, but on that forsaken alpine peak, where no one could fear him and no one had to take his orders, I finally met the man behind that Titanic mask. He turned out to be wounded, stubborn, insufferable, endlessly protective, complex, lonely, and truly alive. He didn't save me perfectly. He didn't love me easily. He didn't transform into a sensitive romantic overnight. But he stayed. He learned. He made his choice. And as I looked at him now on this pier, clutching a fragment of our terrible fall, I finally realized something I would never have believed at 3,000 meters. Sometimes love doesn't fly to you on an orange rescue helicopter with sirens blaring. Sometimes it stubbornly crawls out of the burning wreckage, wounded, bloodied, and soot-covered, with trembling hands lighting your first fire in the icy night, giving you its last warmth and patiently waiting for you to find the courage to simply call it by its name.